Welcome to the channel, where we bring you captivating tales of perseverance, grit, and unexpected victories. If you've ever wondered about the strength of the human spirit and how, even in the darkest times, heroes can rise from the most unlikely places, then you're in the right spot. Today, we dive into an incredible story that is bound to keep you on the edge of your seat. Picture a world on the brink of collapse, where humans and zombies clash in a battle for survival. But amidst this chaos, ordinary people become the unexpected heroes of their time. Before we start, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and ring that bell icon so you never miss an episode of the most inspiring stories out there. Now, let's jump into the story of how humanity fights back against an unstoppable force, where the lines between heroism and despair blur, and the world changes forever. It began as a whisper, a rumor of something strange spreading across the world. People spoke of an illness that turned humans into mindless, aggressive creatures. But it wasn't until the first reports of violent attacks spread like wildfire that the world truly realized the horror they were facing. Cities fell one by one, the outbreak sweeping across continents with terrifying speed. The world that had once been familiar was now a nightmare. Among those who witnessed the early signs of the disaster was Emily, a nurse in a small-town hospital. She had always been devoted to helping others, but she never imagined that her skills would be tested in a way that no medical training had prepared her for. The first case she encountered seemed like any other flu patient at first, until the symptoms rapidly escalated. The patient's fever spiked, and his eyes took on a strange, vacant glow. Within minutes, the man had become a rabid version of himself, attacking anyone in sight. Emily had no choice but to defend herself and the others in the hospital, but the fear and confusion in the air were palpable. As the days passed, more and more townspeople began showing the same signs. News spread that it wasn't just this town, entire countries were succumbing to the same fate. What started as a local issue quickly became a global pandemic. The government's response was quick, but it was no match for the speed at which the infection spread. Martial law was declared, but the chaos was too widespread. People fled their homes, taking refuge wherever they could, but there was nowhere safe from the growing threat. Among the chaos, a small group of survivors took refuge in an old, abandoned factory. Among them was David, a former soldier who had been trained for combat but never expected to face something like this. He and his group had been lucky so far, managing to stay under the radar of the infected. But they knew their time was running out. Supplies were dwindling, and their safe haven would eventually be discovered. David had seen enough to know that their only chance for survival was to fight back, find a way to outsmart the infected and escape the death trap that the world had become. As David rallied his group, a sense of urgency began to fill the air. Their once peaceful world had turned into a dangerous wasteland, and every decision had become a matter of life and death. They needed to plan their next move carefully. It was a high-stakes game of survival, and every choice could mean the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, Emily, who had lost contact with her family during the initial outbreak, found herself in the same city where David's group was hiding. Desperate to find any remaining survivors, she navigated the desolate streets, avoiding the infected at all costs. Her only goal was to stay alive, but deep down, she held on to the hope that she could still save those she loved. When she stumbled upon a group of survivors, she was both relieved and wary. She couldn't trust anyone too easily. But something about the way they banded together and fought for survival gave her a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in weeks. Both David and Emily were on parallel paths, unaware of the other's existence, but fate would soon bring them together. The world around them seemed to crumble with every passing day, yet something told them that in the face of certain death, there was a chance for humanity to rise once again. Stay tuned for Part 2, where the battle intensifies and unexpected alliances are forged in the struggle to survive. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss out on the next chapter of this thrilling fight for humanity's survival. The world outside the factory was a desolate wasteland. The once bustling streets were now filled with the remnants of what had been a thriving civilization. Abandoned vehicles lay overturned, and the buildings that had once been symbols of human achievement now stood as hollow monuments to what had been lost. The infected roamed freely, their mindless groans echoing through the empty streets. The quiet was broken only by the occasional shuffle of the undead or the distant sounds of gunfire, as desperate survivors tried to defend themselves against the growing horde. David's group had fortified their position within the factory, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the infected found them. They had enough food and water to last a while, but the lack of supplies beyond that was a constant concern. They had managed to secure some weapons from abandoned police stations, but ammo was in short supply. David knew that they would eventually need to venture out into the city to scavenge, but the risk was enormous. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the ruins of the city, David gathered his group together. "We can't keep hiding forever," he said, his voice steady but filled with a sense of urgency. "We need to make a move, find a way out of here. There's a supply depot nearby, but it's deep in infected territory. If we want to survive, we need those supplies." The group was hesitant. They had grown comfortable in their hiding place, and the thought of venturing back into the heart of the chaos was terrifying. But David's determination was infectious. They knew that if they didn't act soon, they would eventually run out of food and water. As they began to prepare for the dangerous mission ahead, Emily, miles away, was facing her own struggle. After days of scouring the empty city, she had found a small group of survivors holed up in a local hospital. At first, they were reluctant to let her in. Trust was a luxury no one could afford in this new world. But after hours of conversation and a shared moment of vulnerability, they finally welcomed her into their fold. The survivors were a diverse group, each with their own story of loss and survival. Among them was Marcus, a former firefighter who had lost his family to the infection. He had become the de facto leader of the group, guiding them with a level-headed approach that had kept them alive thus far. Emily quickly formed a bond with him, drawn to his resilience and quiet strength. Together, they began to make plans to escape the city, knowing that staying there for much longer would only mean certain death. Their goal was to reach a nearby military outpost, rumored to be one of the last remaining strongholds of humanity in the area. It was a dangerous journey, but it was their best chance at survival. Emily had no illusions about the odds, they were slim. But the thought of reuniting with her family, or at least finding others who had survived, kept her going. As Emily and Marcus prepared for their journey, fate intervened. In the dead of night, a horde of infected swarmed the hospital, overwhelming the survivors. The chaos was immediate. Screams echoed through the halls as the infected crashed through barricades, their bloodshot eyes fixed on their prey. Emily and Marcus fought their way through the carnage, determined to survive, but the odds were stacked against them. Meanwhile, David and his group had set out on their own perilous mission, navigating the city streets with a mixture of caution and desperation. The infected lurked around every corner, and every step forward was a calculated risk. The group was tense, every noise sending them into a state of high alert. As they neared the supply depot, they encountered a small group of survivors who had been living in the area. Initially, David's group approached them with caution, but when they learned that the survivors had been trapped by a massive horde of infected, they knew they had to help. A fragile alliance was formed, one born out of necessity and the hope that, together, they could stand a chance against the overwhelming odds. The group quickly devised a plan to lead the horde away from the survivors, buying them enough time to escape. It was a risky maneuver, but David had no choice. If they didn't act, the survivors would be lost, and the supplies they so desperately needed would be out of reach. As David and his group prepared to carry out their plan, Emily and Marcus found themselves at a crossroads. They had managed to escape the hospital and were now on the run, unsure of where to go next. With the military outpost their final goal, they knew that their journey was far from over, but the fight to get there would be their hardest yet. Both groups, unaware of each other's existence, were fighting the same battle for survival. Yet, fate would soon draw them together in an unexpected twist that would change everything. The city had become a war zone, with every corner occupied by the undead or survivors fighting to stay alive. David and his group had just completed a risky operation, drawing the infected away from a group of trapped civilians and securing the much-needed supplies. But their victory came at a heavy cost. One of their own, Alex, a skilled medic, had fallen in the chaos. His death was a grim reminder that survival in this new world came with sacrifices. As David stood over Alex's body, his resolve only hardened. The journey ahead was fraught with danger, but there was no turning back now. Their mission was clear: survive at any cost. The supplies they had acquired would only last them so long, and David knew they had to find a more sustainable solution. With the horde temporarily diverted and the survivors safely hidden away, David gathered his team. "We can't afford to lose anyone else," he said, his voice low and steady. "We have to keep moving. There's a military outpost to the north, a place where we might find more help, more resources. But we need to hurry before the infected find their way back here." The group, still grieving their loss, nodded in agreement. Despite the overwhelming odds, they knew their only option was to keep moving forward. The factory wasn't safe anymore. They had to reach the outpost, where hope still lingered. Meanwhile, Emily and Marcus had also faced their own battles. After escaping the hospital, they had made their way through the city, moving cautiously through alleyways and abandoned buildings, avoiding the hordes of infected that roamed the streets. Their plan to reach the military outpost had seemed like a distant dream, but it was the only thing that kept them going. Emily's thoughts often drifted to her family. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were still alive, somewhere out there, waiting for her. Every day was a struggle. They scavenged for food, water, and supplies, carefully rationing what little they had. Their progress was slow, but they were making headway, always staying one step ahead of the infected. Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a haunting sensation, one that grew stronger with each passing day. As they neared the outskirts of the city, Emily and Marcus encountered a problem: an entire street blocked by a large group of infected. They were trapped, with no clear way around the horde. Their options were limited: risk the confrontation or find a way to bypass the infected undetected. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, suggested waiting until nightfall when the infected were less active, hoping they could slip by unnoticed. But as the night fell, things took an unexpected turn. Emily and Marcus weren't the only ones on the move. David and his group, unaware of the other survivors in the city, had also encountered the same street, their path leading them directly into the heart of the infected's territory. The two groups, separated by only a few blocks, were unknowingly drawing closer to one another. The tension in the air was palpable. The slightest noise could alert the horde, and neither group could afford to make a mistake. They moved quietly, relying on their wits and survival instincts to guide them through the perilous streets. But fate had a different plan. In a moment of chaos, a scream pierced the silence. One of David's group members, Lily, had stepped on a piece of broken glass, alerting a nearby infected. The horde surged forward, drawn by the noise. Within moments, both David's group and Emily's group found themselves fighting for their lives, trapped in the middle of a street surrounded by the relentless undead. The battle was fierce. Gunshots echoed through the night as David's group fired into the oncoming wave of infected, while Emily and Marcus fought off those who managed to break through the lines. The chaos was all-consuming, each moment feeling like a desperate race against time. In the heat of the battle, Emily and David's eyes met across the street. It was a fleeting glance, but in that moment, they both realized that they were not alone in this fight. The two groups, struggling to survive, had been brought together by a twist of fate. With no other choice, they quickly formed an uneasy alliance, their combined forces pushing back the infected with every ounce of strength they had left. They fought as one, each person doing their part to hold the line, to survive. As the battle raged on, the tide slowly began to turn. The infected were relentless, but the survivors were resourceful. Slowly but surely, the group managed to push the horde back. When the last of the infected finally fell, the survivors stood among the wreckage of the street, breathing heavily, covered in blood and sweat. Emily, her heart racing, finally stepped forward and introduced herself to David. "We're headed for the military outpost," she said, her voice hoarse but determined. "It's our only chance." David nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We're headed the same way. Looks like we're in this together now." And just like that, two groups of survivors, once strangers to each other, had become an unlikely team, bound together by a shared goal: survival. They knew that the road ahead would be even more dangerous than anything they had faced so far, but for the first time in a long time, they had a glimmer of hope. they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the future of humanity. The survivors, now united under a single banner, moved swiftly through the streets, their path lit only by the faint glow of the moon above. The journey to the military outpost had become their singular mission, their beacon of hope. With every step, they faced the harsh reality of a world that had fallen apart. The city was a shadow of its former self, a sprawling graveyard of broken buildings, empty streets, and the distant sounds of the undead. But they had made it this far, and they weren't about to stop now. David, Emily, Marcus, and the others formed a tight-knit unit. The days of being lone survivors were over. Their group, once strangers, had become something more, a family, bonded by the shared struggle for survival. The unity they had forged in the heat of battle was their greatest strength. As they moved through the abandoned city, they were no longer just fighting to survive, they were fighting for each other. But the closer they got to the military outpost, the more dangerous their journey became. The infected were more concentrated in this area, drawn to the remnants of civilization like moths to a flame. Every street they traversed felt like a calculated risk, and every alleyway seemed to hold a new threat. But despite the mounting danger, they pushed on, their determination unwavering. As they approached a large, dilapidated bridge that led to the outpost, the group paused to assess the situation. The bridge, once a symbol of human engineering and progress, was now a choke point, a perfect place for an ambush. Infected roamed the area in large groups, their moans and growls echoing off the walls. The survivors knew that crossing this bridge would be their greatest challenge yet. But they couldn't turn back. David, the natural leader of the group, stepped forward. "We have to move quickly and silently," he instructed. "We can't afford to alert them. Stick together, and don't break formation. We do this fast, or we don't make it." Emily, her heart pounding in her chest, nodded. "We'll make it. We have to." With that, they began to cross the bridge, moving swiftly but cautiously. Every footstep felt like a risk, every shadow a potential threat. The infected were close, their senses heightened, and any mistake could cost them everything. As they reached the halfway point of the bridge, disaster struck. A lone infected, separated from the main horde, spotted them. It was too late to retreat. The creature let out a guttural scream, its shrill voice cutting through the night. The horde, drawn by the sound, began to converge on the survivors. David's instincts kicked in. He signaled for everyone to run, but the infected were fast, and they were closing in. The group sprinted across the bridge, but the infected were gaining on them. Gunfire echoed through the air as they tried to fend off the horde, but the sound only seemed to attract more of the undead. Panic began to set in as the survivors realized they were trapped on the bridge, nowhere to go but forward. In that moment, Marcus made a split-second decision. He turned back, his weapon raised, ready to hold off the infected for as long as he could. "Go," he shouted. "I'll cover you. Get to the outpost." David hesitated, but he knew what had to be done. "We're not leaving you behind," he yelled. But Marcus shook his head. "You have to survive. I'll hold them off long enough for you to make it." Reluctantly, the group pushed forward, leaving Marcus behind to make his final stand. Emily's eyes lingered on him for a moment, but there was no time to mourn. They had a mission to complete. As the group neared the end of the bridge, a feeling of dread settled over them. They could hear the sounds of battle behind them, the echo of gunshots and screams fading as they neared the military outpost. But there was no time to think about Marcus. They had to make it through the gates, or they would all be lost. The gates of the outpost were heavily fortified, a last bastion of humanity's resistance against the infected. But the soldiers who had once manned the outpost were gone, leaving behind only a skeleton crew. The survivors were greeted by a ragtag group of soldiers, some weary, others visibly shaken by the horrors they had witnessed. But there was no time for introductions. The gates closed behind them with a heavy thud, and the group was finally safe, at least for now. Inside the outpost, the survivors were given a moment to catch their breath. Food, water, and medical supplies were in abundance, but there was no time to waste. The group knew they couldn't stay here forever. The world outside was still crawling with infected, and the military outpost was not the impregnable fortress it had once been. But for the first time in a long while, the survivors allowed themselves a moment of respite. David and Emily stood side by side, looking out over the horizon. The battle was far from over, but they had made it this far. They had lost friends, family, and loved ones along the way, but they had not given up. And as long as they still had the will to fight, there was hope. "We made it," Emily said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. David nodded. "But this is just the beginning." The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, the survivors had a chance. They had come together, against all odds, to fight for humanity's survival. And as long as they stood united, they would continue to fight, knowing that hope, no matter how small, was still alive.